Okay, folks, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We are going to be talking about where do students go and how do you know options for data-starved districts. I am Kathy McDonald, your host for today, Assistant Director for Network Partnerships with the Florida College Access Network. A few housekeeping items before I turn our webinar over to Bill. First, we welcome your questions. This is definitely about us learning together, so I hope you brought your questions with you. Instead of using the chat feature, we're going to use the Q&A feature today. So if you have questions, go ahead and drop those in there. You don't have to wait until the end. Just shoot them in there anytime while you're thinking of them. And then as we get to Q&A time, we'll open those up and check to see what's on your mind. Second, please share what you're learning on social media. We love to see what's resonating with you. If you can use the hashtag FCAN or hashtag TalentStrongFL, that gives us the ability to find you. And finally, as folks ask us all the time, we do record our webinars. You will get a link and to not only the recording, but also the slides after the webinar, typically within a couple of days. Okay, so for those folks who are new to FCAN, just a little bit of background, our mission is to lead the collaborative movement to ensure every Floridian achieves an education beyond high school and a rewarding career. Our vision is to lead a Florida working together where education is the pathway to economic mobility for all. We do our work in three primary ways. First is through our local college access networks, which are cross-sector coalitions of leaders that collaborate to remove barriers and provide more support for student success. Second, we publish research and data on evidence-based practices and policy opportunities to strengthen Florida's talent pool. And third is through our statewide initiatives. We coordinate 4 of them under College Ready Florida that provide schools and community organizations free resources to help students continue their education after high school. Our work is guided by our 7 conditions for success, which you can learn more about on our website. Today's webinar are great examples of opportunity for everyone, clear information and guidance, and effective use of data. Now, I am super excited to welcome our dear friend, Bill DeBon, who's Director of Data and Evaluation with the National College Attainment Network. And in that role, he researches and writes about college access and success programming that demonstrates significant results for student college enrollment and graduation, while additionally providing technical assistance to other initiatives. Bill leads NCAN's benchmarking project, an ongoing collaborative research effort with NCAN members that examine the enrollment and completion outcomes of students served by college access and success programs. The benchmarking project contains key demographic, service, and outcome data on more than 500,000 member served students and provides insights into the college access and success field. Other activities include the creation, development, and maintenance of NCAN's data and evaluation toolkit and the Form Your Future FastFed tracker. Try to say that 5 times fast, and the provision of technical assistance to school districts in projects like the 2 and Through Advising Challenge and the Rural Student Success Initiative. Prior to these, Bill oversaw the 3-year Common Measures Learning Community, which convened 20 NCAN members in an effort to use data to improve program outcomes and scale program capacity. Bill holds a bachelor's degree in political science with a minor in education studies from American University and a master's degree in public policy from George Washington University. And with that, let me stop sharing so that Bill can share and turn the floor over to you. You are going to help us know how to help our districts gain access to data. Welcome, Bill.
Kathy, thank you so much for the warm introduction. Does everything look okay on my screen? Everything, all the sharing looks okay?
Everything looks great. Thanks.
Super, tremendous. Well, thank you all for being here today. Kathy, thank you for the introduction. Thank you to Florida College Access Network for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here. When I say this, please believe me that every state does not have the kind of high quality organization like the Florida College Access Network to provide all these great services and resources and convening opportunities and knowledge. So it's always tremendous to be able to work with you all, and I'm really grateful to be here. So,
hey, Bill,
yeah.
I think you need to, if you're able to swap the display settings, I think we're seeing your background slides.
All right.
Under the display setting.
Yep. Sorry about that.
No worries.
How about now?
If you click on that, that should swap them, I believe.
Right here just a second ago. Hold on 1 second.
Yeah, no
I'm
worries.
sorry about this, folks. Give me 1 second. This is like a classic example of the best laid plans. About now? No?
Kristen, can you chime in?
You're still seeing the presenter view?
Not seeing any of your slides.
Oh. Okay. Well, how about now? Let's see.
Still the same situation where I think we're seeing your next slide in your notes, but maybe that's okay as well.
I don't.
Okay, well, what we can do, if you don't mind stopping share, I can go back to sharing mine, and
I'll just click on the presenter view. I think that should help.
Okay.
I'm so sorry.
No worries. Thanks everyone for your patience.
Yeah, to our audience, I promise this works. Just a second ago. Okay, how's this?
I think that is right. Kristen, are we seeing the right thing? Okay, good.
Looks
We
great.
are good. Thank you, ma'am.
All right, sorry about that. All right, so you've already heard about my introduction. So I'm here to talk about 2 really important questions today. Where do students go and how do you know? So I talk a lot with K-12 districts and schools, and there's a lot of confusion about what is available out there in terms of understanding students' post-secondary pathways. So I'm hoping that I will be able to show you some different options, talk about the trade-offs involved with each of them, talk a little bit about how to fold these data back into post-secondary advising, how to think about, what questions to be asking of the data and what questions different data sources allow you to ask, and hopefully provide some clarity where you may not have had some before. So here is my contact information. Please do make use of it. I wouldn't put it up here if I didn't want you to contact me. I'm always happy to answer questions. I can't always guarantee that I have the right answers to the questions, but I usually can connect you to someone who does if that person isn't me. Here are my goals for today. I want to explore what some of the different options are about accessing data about students' post-high school pathways. I want to talk a little bit about how to leverage that data to better understand students' choices and how that differs from their intentions. And I really hope that I will leave plenty of time for your questions and thoughts. I did see a lot of the thoughtful questions that you all submitted during registration, and I'm grateful for them. And if I don't get to them today, or if I don't get to them over the course of my presentation, please do bring them up during Q&A. So if you don't know NCAN, I hope that you, I hope that you do know NCAN, but if you don't, we are a nonprofit member organization in Washington, D.C. And we are committed to closing the pernicious post-secondary access and attainment gaps that we have nationwide. We do our work largely through 3 strands of work: building network capacity, advocating for policy solutions both at the federal and the state levels, and supporting systems change so that different kinds of stakeholders have the resources and the connections to each other that they need to adopt effective strategies for students. We do this work because, as I'm sure a lot of you know, talent is everywhere, but opportunity is not. You can see the disparate college enrollment rates that we have by different high school categories. This is from the class of 2018. And then, of course, those have been exacerbated over the past 2 and continuing into this academic year, over the past 2 and change academic years because of the COVID-19 pandemic, where we have seen post-secondary enrollment fall in a very inequitable way by high school category. So let me start off here by asking a question, trying to take a baseline. What is currently your biggest hurdle to tracking post-secondary outcomes data? And I believe Kathy's got a question here right on time. just want to get a sense of what some of the obstacles are that are keeping you from tracking post-secondary outcomes data now. And I realize that it could be more than one, totally get that. I would say please pick the most prominent one, fully understanding that it can be kind of an amalgam of them.
I did give him multiple choice options,
Oh,
so yes.
Even better. Okay, good.
Just
Flexible
because
data.
I knew there's probably more, even though you said biggest hurdle, but there
Okay.
can be more than one. So
Super.
yeah. Okay, it looks like we're slowing down. So let me give it 2 more seconds. Okay, so let's share those results. So as you can see, don't know where to find the data. So obviously poignant for the topic, but also lack of time and staff, which I think you anticipated.
Yeah, well, I will say that our audience then is well matched for this presentation or vice versa. So that's really great. And hopefully I will help you, at least get closer to surmounting that hurdle by the end of this presentation. Also totally understand the lack of time and capacity. It feels like we always have plenty of on our plates right now. And sometimes the data analysis piece just isn't there. Okay, so back on my, okay. So before I get into some of the different ways to look at post-secondary outcomes data, I just want to kind of level set here on what is this data helping you to answer? And so to me, like, these are some of the key questions that no matter the data source, that districts and schools and organizations that support them and practitioners should be working to be able to answer. And obviously there's a lot of questions here. These are kind of the big ticket post-secondary outcomes questions to me. And of course, the biggest one here is, how do the outcomes from these questions vary by student demographics, so that we can make sure that we're keeping equity in mind and understanding where to target resources and how resources and approaches need to differ according to students' characteristics, students' backgrounds. So let me ask one more question here. How are you currently tracking student outcomes?
So folks, the polls opened up. Getting lots of votes. So we have access to National Student Clearinghouse data, a state source. We don't currently track post-secondary outcomes, partner reporting, or other. I know I said please specify in the chat, but since we don't have the chat enabled, if you've got ideas of where else you might be gathering that data, if you could share it in the Q&A so we can get a pulse of that too, that would be great. Okay, voting is slowing down, so let me go ahead and share the results there.
Wow.
So you do have, 50% on the call do have National Student Clearinghouse data, so that's great to hear. And then it's a mix from there.
Okay, that is encouraging and surprising on the 50% NSC access piece. That's awesome. We'll definitely be talking about the NSC later on. And for the 34% of you who don't currently track, hopefully we'll give you some options here to think about. Okay, so these are not the only 4 pathways, but here are the 4 pathways that I'm going to talk about in terms of measuring post-secondary outcomes. And as we step up the ladder here, we're getting more into the level of sophistication. So what I mean by sophistication, I mean kind of how granular you can get on the data, what kinds of outcomes metrics you can look at, how reliable the data are. In some cases, there are trade-offs between how much work you have to put in versus what you're getting out. So we're gonna step up the ladder here together and take a look at the pros and cons of each one of these. So where I want to start is a place that I think is familiar for a lot of school personnel, which are student surveys. And so I think about these as being time intensive, overall, generally speaking, less reliable, but you're keeping it all in-house. You don't have to go to any external partners. You don't have to worry about external data sources. You can develop these data all in-house. So the pros are, this is relatively inexpensive in terms of money, in terms of administration. The flip side of that is that this is time intensive. Staff costs and administration costs on students' time and classroom time and time to analyze, those are relatively more expensive here. surveys are very flexible. They're easily adapted to a school's particular needs. They are relatively easy to build out and analyze. Sometimes they are built into school information systems or student data portals. SurveyMonkey exists. I'm sure we're all familiar with that at this point. Some of the other cons, student surveys, I think, as a general rule, are going to be less scientific, less reliable, because you are relying on student responses. And so you're going to have, you're going to be kind of prone to sampling bias here and also respondent bias. There are ways to control for that, but unless you are really kind of deep into survey methodology, you may not be thinking too much about the respondent and sampling bias pieces here. So again, this is something that you're already probably pretty familiar with. A lot of schools and districts already use senior exit surveys. But from what I've seen and from what my colleagues at MCAN have seen is that although the data get collected, they're not often being used in a really effective way. They're normally administered, as far as we can see, later on in the spring. And when they're administered that late, kind of the window to make the data usable is smaller. So the earlier you administer this, a survey like a senior exit survey, even if it's in September, October of the senior year, that gives you a much broader window in which to act and to intervene and to kind of change students' post-secondary trajectories. In terms of data collection, how do you collect these data? I think electronic surveys certainly would be preferable so that we don't have to do all the data entry. But then again, you also need to have a system to think about who's completed this and who hasn't. That goes back to the sampling and respondent bias piece. If you have systematic differences in who's responding and who's not responding, then the data you're getting from a student survey and the conclusions you draw from that data are also going to be biased. You want to try to make sure that you have as complete a data file as possible. So if you're going to have an electronic survey, some way to verify who has and hasn't completed it, really important. I put in here some of the key items that we think are really valuable for administering senior exit surveys. Part of this is about getting understanding of what a student's post-secondary intentions are, getting detail about where they anticipate heading, seeing kind of what key milestones they've already completed. Have they completed the FAFSA or not? Do they have concerns about getting their housing deposit paid, or how they're going to get to campus the following fall? What's the level of confidence that they have about their post-secondary intention? That can be really useful if you have any summer melt programming for understanding who may need more intensive support over the summer. One thing that's super, super key about senior exit surveys, absolutely want to verify students' birth dates and legal names. That's because those data can be used to verify enrollment and post-secondary outcome data, or post-secondary outcomes with a national student clearinghouse later on. So you want to get one, more bite of the apple to make sure that you have all the directory information that you will need to make a match on students' post-secondary outcomes. And then really important, confirming contact information. We'll talk about why in one second. So
Bill, Tracy shared a really interesting con with student surveys, which I know you've seen, which is when you have changes in district leadership, they often want different metrics measured or reported. And so that starts to muck up your data when you're comparing years to years and trying to build longer term strategies.
Yeah, that's totally true. If you're not going to keep the same survey kind of longitudinally, then yeah, it's definitely going to mess up your trend data. And so you want to be thoughtful about which items are you changing year to year. There is some flex, right? If you want to add or subtract some items that are of particular interest to administrators, for example, but you probably want to keep a core of those questions static over time. So everything we just talked about is kind of the pre graduation part of this, but we also need a post survey in order to verify what happened to students. Again, the whole point of this webinar here is to talk about tracking post-secondary outcomes. And so, sure, you can collect data on where students intended to enroll and what their plans were, but you also need to do some verification of, did that actually happen or not? So depending on what your capacity or your appetite for this approach is, you can call a random sample of seniors in the following fall and the following spring to hear if they enrolled. Students, I guess, giving a false report here certainly is a possibility. But if you're going this route, I think that is an uncertainty that you kind of you're going to have to live with. You're going to have to bake into the process. You can either call a random sample of seniors if you got the email, and if you had the emails from the pre-part of the survey, you can email them and have them do it that way. I get a better response rate that way. You can also issue a post survey, and so you can send that out via collector on SurveyMonkey or whatever your preferred survey platform is, and make sure that you're putting in here an ID that you can link back to the senior exit survey. So either the first name and last name or a student's ID. You just want to be able to link the pre-results and the post results. And so, once you got that, and you can see, okay, did the student actually report enrolling in the post survey, match that up with what the intentions were in the pre, you can start to get a rough cut of your enrollment rates. I think a real level up here is to start administering a post-secondary intentions survey every year, starting in the 9th grade. It doesn't have to be the exact same survey every year, but with a core of questions about, what is your post-secondary aspiration? What do you have a career pathway in mind? Do you have, are you aware that, you can get financial aid for college by completing the FAFSA? I think there's a useful core of questions here to ask in the 9th, 10th, and 11th grades too. And the value here is that it offers a chance to look at a student's trajectory over the course of 4 years to see how their aspirations and plans are changing. And then also to triage appropriate supports to students based on those aspirations, based on their academic profile and other kind of characteristics. So if you have a student, if you're looking at your academic data and they have the academic profile to be able to succeed at a 4-year institution, but they indicate to you on the survey that that's not their aspiration, or that's not where they see their trajectory going, maybe that's a flag to have a conversation to talk about potentially their potential undermatch in terms of post-secondary pathway. Just offers you, again, a longer time window in which to intervene with students and provide them with the appropriate resources. So again, just to summarize here, I think the value of a student survey is not relying on outside data sources, being able to keep that all in-house. Disadvantage, again, relatively unreliable and really dependent on the execution here for how successful it'll be. I do include here a bunch of resources about student surveys, so that this college advising course senior exit survey guide is particularly good, and I would highly recommend it to you. And then I have some other sample surveys and items here, just in case you're looking for inspiration on what kinds of questions to include in a senior exit survey. So our next step up the ladder is making progress one by one via direct relationships with institutions. And what I mean here is establishing memoranda of understanding or data sharing agreements with the post-secondary institutions to which your students are matriculating, and then getting information about their post-secondary enrollments directly from those institutions. So a few pros here. One, if you're making the time to go through the MOU and data sharing agreement process with an institution, I think it really helps to build that kind of K-12 higher ed partnership and relationship, which is always good. We want to see those pipelines solidified. Once you've got that relationship, it should be relatively easy to get the data and to analyze it. And this should be also fairly low cost. The cons, well, there aren't a ton of people out there who really love the process of going through data sharing agreements, if we're being really honest. I think just the phrase MOU or data sharing agreement tends to elicit a lot of groans, and I can understand why. So that's a hurdle. Another con is that it's always going to be an incomplete picture of your whole graduating class, because 100% of your students are not going to one institution. So it can be really useful to capture a significant portion of your matriculation pipeline. Never going to capture the whole thing. This also doesn't scale well. I guess those last 2 points are related. You don't want to be going through this process with 15, 20, 25 institutions. And so, the shape of your matriculation pattern and pipeline matters a lot. if you have something like, these numbers are fairly arbitrary, so don't take them as, as the letter of the law. If you have upwards of 60% of your students going to 4 or 5 institutions, then it makes sense to try to set up memorandum of understanding or data sharing agreement with those institutions. If you have something that looks like, the image here on the right, that's not going to be worth your time. This is not a good fit for that kind of matriculation pattern. Because again, you're going to need to probably work through the registrar's office, maybe bring in admissions, who may be a good champion for making the case that a data sharing agreement here is appropriate. But setting up those relationships is going to take time, and that can be a little bit, frustrating. Now, this may be a place where, school counseling departments may already have a relationship with institutions where their students are matriculating most often. So if you're already getting lists of who's applied, for example, to an institution, I don't think it's that much more of a step to start getting the enrollment data, right? To sign a data sharing agreement to get the enrollment piece. And what that I think looks like is sending a list of students to an institution. Maybe that list is informed by the senior exit survey about where students intended to enroll, and then asking, the institution, do you have a current enrollment for this student right now? And then matching those lists back. Okay, our next step up the ladder here is what I really think about as being the luck of the draw and using state data portals. So I say this luck of the draw because it's really wholly dependent on the nature and quality and execution and updating of a state data portal. I've seen some very good ones. I've seen some that are not so great. I've seen some that are nearly non-existent, that are either so outdated or so limited in terms of what they provide to you that it's not even worth going that route. I will say that I find state data staff usually pretty amenable to research requests. They usually have a formal policy or process for submitting research requests out of a state longitudinal data system, and that's great. And especially if your state is including college career readiness in any kind of accountability model, like for ESSA accountability, for example, then that means that the outcomes data that you're looking for in terms of college career readiness probably already built into the system somewhere. And that can be really helpful on the reporting side. Again, the cons, really variable functionality from state to state. Sometimes only school level data are available, and the metrics that you can ask for are inflexible. There's not a lot of customization a lot of times. When we're talking about post-secondary outcomes from state data portals, because states are often pulling their post-secondary enrollment data from public institutions, they're excluding, private independent institutions. And depending on, again, the shape of your matriculation pattern in your district or school, that could potentially omit, a sizable chunk of students. Usually the post-secondary outcomes data from the public institutions is coming from a partnership with the Board of Regents or whatever the analog is in a state. And so they're often not going to have access to post-secondary enrollment data for private independent institutions. Data lags, definitely a problem with this approach. It is not uncommon to see data lag by a year or 2 or even 3 in terms of academic years. And I guess if you're looking at a state data portal today, whose latest update is the 2018-19 academic year, it turns out we have had a lot of changes happen since the 2018-19 academic year, and you may not want to be benchmarking your post-secondary outcomes against a, for example, pre-pandemic year. The last con here is that navigating state education agency websites is often unintuitive. I spend a lot of time looking through them. I spend a lot of time looking specifically for post-secondary outcomes data on state education agency websites. And I swear sometimes I feel like I've wandered into like a funhouse, and it's like funhouse mirrors where I'm just honestly not sure which different pathways and links, where they're going to take me, what they're going to show me, whether I'm getting anywhere, whether I'm just going to be trapped in the state education agency website for the rest of my natural born life. So let's talk a little bit more about state data portals. So you may see these also referred to as state longitudinal data systems, or SLDSs. Again, we're talking about pretty variable quality here. On the public facing side, they usually consist of a set menu of reports that have interactive, sometimes they have interactive tables or dashboards. Usually these are available at the district and school levels, sometimes at the county level. Florida, has county-based schools, so surely the county level for Florida. And so that having it at the school and district level does make it easy for benchmarking comparison to other districts and schools, but it's a shortcoming on the looking for individual student level data side. Some, not all SLDSs have user logins for viewing student level data. Michigan, I think, is kind of the gold standard here. Their My School Data, MI School Data, little pun there from the state of Michigan, I think is like the gold standard for these. There's a really good public facing side, but then counselors can also log in to the back end and see individual student level outcomes, and that data is informed by both the Board of Regents and National Student Clearinghouse data. So, even if you can't get student level data here through a state data portal, I think if you're just starting out on the post-secondary data journey piece, having school level outcomes, especially if they're broken out by student groups within a school, that is way, way better than nothing. That is a fine place to start. And it's a good launching pad for understanding kind of the general shape of your students' post-secondary outcomes. The granularity that you can get from student level outcomes, we'll talk about in a second, that really lets you ask some different questions and dive a little bit deeper. And the answers to those questions really can shape post-secondary advising a little bit more than just looking at school level outcomes. But again, it's a kind of a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush kind of thing. So if you can only get school level data, perfectly fine place to start. So let's take a look at Florida. I found some Florida post-secondary data through two different places. First is edudata.floridadoe.org. You can find kind of the state report card, district report cards, school report cards, and in the school report cards, you can then find post-secondary continuation rates. That looks like this, so you can get whole counts of post-secondary enrollers. You can get percentages as a class. You can select by graduation year. You can see the most recent graduation here is 2018-19. I won't repeat my spiel here for that I did just a minute ago, but you can again see the kind of data lag that we're talking about on these data. The other place that I saw some pretty good information about Florida is the Florida Education and Training Placement Information Program. Kathy had trouble with the Form Your Future FAFSA tracker. This one I think is even a little bit trickier than that. But this is a data collection and consumer reporting system that has follow-up on former students and program participants. And so you can again see high school level reports here from 2018-19. Now, I think this is pretty interesting. I would really recommend checking out the FETPIP cards here. There's data here that you don't normally see from state data systems that I thought was pretty neat. But this is the piece about post-secondary outcomes that you can get from FETPIP. Whether students are in the Florida college system, whether in a state university system, whether they're in a private college university, this gives you an institutional breakdown that is fairly granular and I think pretty useful to have by high school. Now, it's not giving you data by student demographics by these outcomes, right? So that's another layer deeper that I think is useful. But a lot of states are not providing you this on the part of the post-secondary pipeline. The other interesting piece from FETPIP that I didn't put in here, but I want to mention because it's on the report card, is about wage data, which is really interesting. I haven't seen kind of the wage data and the post-secondary pathway data all put into the same card in too many places, so that's pretty valuable. Just to give you a look at what some other states have. I chose Mississippi here because our partners at the Woodward Hines Education Foundation may have sent some attendees this way, and so if you're here from Mississippi, welcome. This is an example of what you can get from the LifeTrack system. You can see the different kinds of metrics that they have here on LifeTracks, and then selecting each one of these at a graduation year or a longitudinal year. If you click historical trends, that gives you some pretty good school level indicators. There's a different website through Mississippi that lets you just get like the top line numbers for district and school level comparison. Again, this is not granular. There's only so much that you can do with this, but you can look at it longitudinally and give yourself a general sense of how post-secondary enrollment is going. Very hard to shift post-secondary advising on the basis of top line figures like this though. Let me give you just one more state. This is from the state of Georgia. This is the Governor's Office of Student Achievement. And so you can see, you can select by district here, select by school, and see what the graduate outcomes were a year after high school graduation. Now, one thing I think is really interesting here is that it includes whether or not students are working, or whether they're enrolled. Very helpful to have those in the same chart. It also gives you the top in-state and out-of-state colleges and universities. So if you're not going to use National Student Clearinghouse data in Georgia, this gives you a good sense of which institutions your students are most often matriculating to. That's a very actionable data point in terms of post-secondary advising practice. So you've seen just in the 4 or 5 slides here, the way this gets displayed on state data portals is not standardized. You're going to have to kind of check out exactly what your state offers you, and what the state offers is really going to drive which questions you can ask from these data. So let me get my sip of water here, 1 second.
Well, and Bill, while you're catching your breath, Shirley's asking if a similar system exists in New York. I don't know if you know all the states per se, but
I don't know off the top of my head, but I would be happy to look it up and send a follow up if you can send in your email or email me after the session too. That's perfectly fine. I'm happy to look it up.
Sounds great.
All right, so we're through 3 of the 4 steps that I told you I would talk about at the top of this presentation. And if you're anything like me, as I was going through making this PowerPoint deck, I got to this part and I said, there has got to be a catch here, right? Because I feel like all I've been doing for the first 3 is kind of providing caveats about, yes, there are some benefits here, but there's a lot of drawbacks, and here's what the drawbacks are. And so if you're thinking there's got to be a catch here, yeah, kind of, you're right. I mean, there are definitely significant trade-offs to the first 3 that we're talking about. And I'm so pleased to see that about half of our audience, or at least half of survey respondents in our audience, have access to National Student Clearinghouse data. And so this is where I say that this is where the learning curve really pays off. And so I'm going to talk a minute in just a second about the National Student Clearinghouse, but let me give you some top line pros and cons here. So to me, this approach has the most comprehensive college enrollment, persistence, attainment data available out there. The data that come here are timely, they're flexible, they're longitudinal, they're very affordable for the quality of the data and the time that you're saving and tracking down these outcomes. There are kind of pre-constructed reports that come from the student tracker that are really helpful, even if you never dug into the detail data that comes with it. Just having the PDF packet that comes is quite useful. And they are working on a new version of this NSC student tracker platform that I think is going to make usability a much more enjoyable experience. What are some of the downsides of the NSC student tracker? This is more expensive than any of the other options that I discussed here, unless we're talking about kind of time costs for administering a student survey. So right now, the rate for student tracker is $595 per high school per year. So that's obviously much more expensive than $0. But again, I think the cost benefit here, I think the benefit certainly outweighs the cost. Another con here is that there is a steep learning curve, and it's not really plug and play. You really do kind of need to know what you're doing and what questions to ask of these data to maximize the benefit. So Kathy, I think actually I'm going to skip this question if that's okay, since we already have a pretty good sense of attendees and access to NSC data.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay.
Yep.
So if you haven't heard of the National Student Clearinghouse, they are an organization that is a 501c6, and they collect student level enrollment data from about 98%, covering about 98% of all the enrollments in the United States in a given year. And they kind of warehouse all this enrollment data, just millions and millions and millions of records of enrollment data. And they offer this student tracker service, which allows high school and educational outreach organizations to send in lists of students that they're serving and then get sent back a matched list of all the post-secondary enrollments for those students. Now you match on things like high school graduation date, first name and last name, and date of birth. That's why it's really important, going all the way back to the student survey portion of this, to have really good data about students' legal first and last names and their actual dates of birth. So The Student Tracker for high school lets you set baselines for enrollment, persistence, and completion, so that if you're going to engage in more intensive college career readiness work, you can see, am I making improvements or not on these key outcomes? They also provide national benchmarks against which you can compare your outcomes. NCAN does this in our benchmarking project. We compare against the NSC high school benchmarks kind of series. So again, this works. You submit a file of the student cohort you want to study. The NSC runs your file against all the millions of records in their national student record database. They compile the matches and they send it back to you. Okay, well, what does it look like from there? You wind up getting a PDF that's, I don't know, 50 or 60 slides of charts that look like this, that break your student enrollment and persistence and completion out by institutional sector, 2-year, 4-year, in-state, out-of-state, and it gives you data for up to 8 high school graduating classes. So every year you update your graduate file with the NSC with your most recent graduating class data. And then this kind of just gives you a rolling 8-year report 3 times a year to look at post-secondary outcomes data. They're not all line charts like this. You also get charts like this, which show you, okay, within an academic year, what were students' post-secondary statuses? And so you can see that they're newly enrolled, they're continuing to enroll, they've stopped out, they've attained a degree of some kind, and it shows you what kind. And they will give you that for as many years out as a high school graduating class is. And so you can start to answer questions like, well, when are my students most often stopping out? I'm going to come back to this idea in just one second, but let me show you one more piece from NSC. The other piece is they send you a list of the top 25 institutions your students attended. I think this is extremely valuable. I know that most districts and schools have a good sense of where their students are going. I think to be able to quantify that is extremely valuable because it lets you have a conversation with an institution that says, we are sending you X% of our high school graduating class over the past Y number of years. And when you compare the percentage of students you're sending against those students' outcomes at those institutions, that can drive a really powerful conversation about what kinds of supports students might need. If you're, for example, sending 40% of your students to an institution and only seeing a 30% second-year persistence rate, I think at least one of 2 things has to happen. Either it needs to trigger something about rethinking the post-secondary advising strategy about where students are headed, or need to drive a conversation with the institution about what student supports are and why students aren't persisting, or both of those things need to happen. But being able to quantify the matriculation pattern, super valuable. Now, all of these slides came from what they call the aggregate report, like this packet, this PDF of slides that comes pre-constructed. It also comes with a detail report. This is a sample of what this looks like. And this is every line is a post-secondary enrollment for a student by a range of dates. Now, this is not super easy to work with. Like totally understand that part of it. I think the new version of Student Tracker is going to fix that interaction a lot. But if you have the capacity or can outsource the capacity to really dig into these data, it's super valuable to look at student characteristics by where they're matriculating, by their outcomes. To be able to look at a chart like this and say, when do my students stop out when they go to ABC institution? And then to be able to take that to the institution and say, listen, our students are doing fine with you in year 1 and year 2, but by year 3, nearly half the students that we sent to you have stopped out. I mean, to be able to put numbers behind those concepts is really important. And it's not just the conversation with the institution, it's also a conversation looking backward with upcoming classes of high school seniors to say, I understand that you are intending to enroll or to matriculate to these institutions. Data from our previous classes show that, X number of students stop out by this year when they matriculate. That's a really powerful data-driven conversation to have with students and families. And it all is in the service of trying to connect students with a place where they have the highest likelihood of persisting and attaining a post-secondary degree or credential. I want to leave time for Q&A, but let me just give you a couple of parting thoughts about this. Rome wasn't built in a day. Collecting some data and building from there is way better than not collecting any data. You're always going to have a square one. You're always going to have a first step. It's not always going to be satisfying. There's always going to be there will always be questions that you want to answer that you are not able to answer yet. There will always be more questions to answer, but that doesn't mean, and it doesn't invalidate the questions that you can answer right now. And so I think there's a lot of value to looking at the list of questions I said at the beginning of this presentation and thinking, okay, how many of these can I answer? What data do I have available to me now? And what am I really doing with the answers to the questions that I can answer? Like, how can they inform my post-secondary advising strategy now? How can they change the trajectory of where students go? And how will changing that trajectory help my students be more successful? I realize, I'm just gonna put this out there as a full disclosure, I realize that the fourth part of this fourth step of this presentation, where I'm saying the best option, in my estimation, is a fee-for-service kind of platform from the National Student Clearinghouse. I realize that will cause some hand-wringing in the audience. This isn't intended to be a sales pitch for the NSC. Like, we do partner with them, but I'm not being paid to say this. This is just my opinion that this is the most comprehensive look at post-secondary outcomes data that we can get access to. They're the only place in the country that has the enrollment data at this level. And it's the only place where you can kind of do this student level match to get post-secondary enrollment outcomes data back. So let me just say that part about if the fourth part of this sounded like an NSC pitch, it is only to the extent that I'm giving you my earnest opinion about where the best quality post-secondary outcomes data can come from. I will say NCAN is really thinking hard about how can we help states best connect districts and schools with post-secondary enrollment data. It's going to be a real focus for us. We hope for the next 2 or 3 years at the very least. We're always happy to talk about how to use these data now. If you have an NSC data file now that you're really not sure how to make the most use of, please don't lose my email address. Please drop me a line. I'd be happy to talk about it. And stay tuned as we continue to try to improve the usability of post-secondary outcomes data. The other piece here that I have not had a full amount of time to talk to because it is such a big topic is about connecting data to changing post-secondary advising practice. Let me make a down payment to you on that front. Our big piece about using enrollment data to drive counseling and programming practices is around fit and match advising. So where have students gone from your school or district? How successful have they been there? How have those first 2 questions varied by student demographics? And how can you use the answers to these questions to inform successful moves for future classes? Because this isn't just, okay, well, the class 2021 is gone. There's not a lot we can do, to help them now. No, but there's a lot you can do to use the data from the class of 21, 20, 19, 18, 17, all the way down to inform advising for future classes, imagining that they are substantially similar in a lot of ways. So again, here's my email. If you have questions or comments, please do reach out. I've left some time for Q&A. I suspect there are a bunch of questions, and I am looking forward to trying to answer them. Thank you again for letting me talk with you today. I really appreciate it.
Excellent. Thanks, Bill. We did get quite a few questions coming in. And related to your question around data help for districts and communities, Patrick shared if we all agree that data that helps guide direction of resource allocation programs, course selection, and support, why do we not have in place a national data support center that's available to educators and related agencies at no cost? So just thought I'd give you the opportunity to respond to the elephant in the room.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I ask a variation of it a lot. I mean, the fact of the matter is that these enrollment data, a database like this doesn't actually exist at the federal level. There's actually a prescription against it right now. the federal government is not allowed to collect a database like this. There is legislation that has been proposed and supported by a lot of organizations out there in NCAN space to increase the transparency of post-secondary data, and then to also make available resources for how to use these data more effectively. I don't have a good answer for you about why we don't have that level of transparency right now, but I certainly understand it is a pain point, and Ken's doing all we can to within our sphere of providing technical assistance and professional development to try to provide those resources.
We get the question a lot, and we hear it. We feel the pain too. So Allison's asking, in your experience, who typically takes responsibility for tracking student outcomes in the school districts and CAN's worked with? I assume larger urban districts typically have dedicated personnel who focus on data and reporting, but what about in smaller districts with very lean staffing models? Who's the person who actually designs and administers the surveys, negotiates the DSAs, digs for state data, et cetera?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I guess, unfortunately, I would say to you, this is not meant to be tongue-in-cheek whatsoever. In smaller districts, I would say that the answer is often no one, right? When we have worked with much smaller districts, that the amount of time that it takes an FTE to do these kinds of data-related activities is prohibitive. So the answer is no one. I think on setting up DSAs and MOUs, that's probably going to be some combination of a superintendent and general counsel because the legalese is involved. On working with data files, I've seen everything from a particularly Excel savvy math teacher to heads of counseling to, again, district level staff, whoever's responsible for accountability reporting to the state, assessment coordinators, kind of whatever, vaguely, blurry edge, like mathy data person a district can have or has, or who can pinch hit on those activities, tends to fall on their plate. But I will say that one of the challenges with working, especially with the NSC data here, is that these data are not like the assessment data, and the data files aren't in the same shape as the assessment data. They're not as clear cut. They require some transformation. And so I think that has been a choke point, is that it turns out education data analysts are not uniformly distributed across the country, and having access to one and the resources to pay and retain an education data analyst for a district, it's often not really an option, right? And so to make really effective use of the detail file for NSC, you have someone who can transform the file, who can ask the right questions to the data, and then of course can communicate the implications of those questions back to counseling staff and student-facing staff. So I think you've hit on what some of the pain points are there, is that when I say that these data aren't plug and play, and that there's a steep learning curve, even someone who's really data savvy is going to have to read up or train up on how to use these data in a thoughtful way.
So what you're telling me is I guided my son right in becoming a data analyst and studying that in college. So related to that, that's obviously the question within the school district, but for non-high school, so community-based organizations, for instance, using the student tracker, Jessica's asking for outreach programs. Her experience is that they only get one CVS file to download the full raw data by each semester. Will NSC ever provide the visualizations that you were sharing earlier with non-high school organizations? Any idea whether that's in the works?
Yeah, so student tracker for outreach. So there's student tracker for high school, and that's what a lot of my presentation here focused on. There's also student tracker for educational organizations and student tracker for outreach organizations that specifically meet all these different kinds of criteria. My understanding is that when they launch Student Tracker 3.0, and I think the rollout for that is going to happen later this year, it will be a phased rollout, but it should start later this year, is that when they onboard outreach organizations, educational organizations, that they will get access to the same kinds of visualizations that high schools get. That is not something that has historically happened. Just like you mentioned, high schools have been getting the aggregate report with all the fun, charts and graphs that I showed you, and a detail file. Outreach orgs have only been getting the detail file. And so, yeah, there's a utility problem there, because that means CBOs absolutely have to have someone to cut and visualize that data to make good use of it. There isn't just a PDF of insights that's coming along with the release each year.
And then Patrick is asking, so we have two sides of the coin. One side is the high school data and information that's managed by the school districts, but then we also have it on the other side, which is the post-secondary data side. So is there an agency organization that's capturing the data on both sides?
This is not water that I swim in altogether too often, so I'm gonna caveat with that. But I will say that the National Student Clearinghouse also serves post-secondary institutions. They have something called the Post-Secondary Data Partnership that provides a lot of different kinds of metrics for institutions. There is like a kind of student tracker instance for post-secondary institutions too. So that's an option. I will say states, State Board of Regents, higher ed commissioners, they often have kind of similar analog data portals to what I talked about on the K-12 side here, with all the same kinds of caveats in terms of data lags and kind of inflexibility of reporting and things like that. But there are often state data portals for who is enrolling, who is persisting, at least for the public institutions in a state. They're also doing a bunch of data releases related to that as well.
Okay, I think we've got time for maybe just a couple more. Where and how do you collect data for students who enroll and or complete non-degree trade certificate programs? It's my understanding that's not tracked in National Student Clearinghouse.
No, I mean, not comprehensively, not nearly as comprehensively as kind of 2- and 4-year institutions. The credential side is something that I think they're trying to add more of, but it's a slower ground game than it is with partnering with institutions on degree information. Some states are providing some information on certificates and kind of workforce outcomes. And not that those are in the same bucket, but certificate outcomes and or workforce outcomes. That part just varies much more from state to state. That's not meant to be a punt. It's something that I get asked a lot about from NCAN membership. If you're wondering why there isn't good data here, part of it is that I don't think the incentives are quite the same. I think there's more accountability that we're putting on institutions related to their degree outcomes, and the NSC historically has partnered with institutions because of like student loan reporting and student loan verification, for example. And so there's just more institutions where there's a real ROI for them to be partnered with the NSC. That same kind of like incentive structure just doesn't exist really for a lot of certificate and credential providers. Kristen, did you want to jump in and talk about certificates in Florida specifically?
Unfortunately, we don't have too much more to add. I mean, but I will say that as a state, Florida has committed to increasing data on who has a certificate in Florida, where they're at. I expect they're gathering that data now. So that could be a few years down the road, but happy to see that the state wants to share information on who has certificates.
It's definitely something that I get asked about a lot in the field. And so I'm hoping as we look at the fuller picture of post-secondary education, we do start, being able to show that fuller picture. We, Bill, only have time for one more very quick question. Jessica's asking, do you think that Guide Ed, I think, Insight is a valuable subscription service to help with visualizing NSC data? Are there other similar services available that you might recommend?
Yeah, so Guided Insight is a platform that is coming from an NCAN member, Degrees of Change, out in Tacoma, Washington. If you look at the NCAN website or you search ncan.org for Guided Insight, you can actually see a blog post that I wrote about them recently with an interview on there. I think it is a valuable resource. I'm excited about some of the functionality they're adding there in terms of being able to transform the NSC detail file and kind of dig even deeper to, for example, segment student outcomes by the programs they're involved with, at the high school level. So I think they're being really thoughtful about how to transform and visualize those data as well. And let me just say, Kathy, I know we're at the end of our time here.
Yeah.
If you asked a question and you weren't able to get it answered, I will Kathy, if you're willing to do it, I'm happy to get the list of questions, and I will absolutely follow up with you within the next couple of days.
Sounds great. Thanks, Bill. Really appreciate it. For folks, we are at the top of the hour. Our next webinar is in 2 weeks, February 8th, 3 to 4 p.m., how colleges can become more welcoming to undocumented students. This is the second part of our 2-part series around supporting undocumented students. I am super excited about this. We're going to have our executive director, Charlita Richardson, leading that one. Her guest will be Dr. Karen Holbrook, who's the regional chancellor of USF Sarasota Manatee, and Dr. Cynthia Carvajal, who's director of immigrant student success at CUNY. So super excited to kind of, tell both sides of that story. Thank you especially to Bill today, a great overview of what are our options. As is always the case with data, there's pluses and minuses to every source, and we appreciate you helping us break that down. And with that, everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. We are thrilled to have you, and stay safe out there.
Bye. Thank you, Kathy.